This is a production of Cornell University.
So first and foremost, I want to welcome you all to the first ever agroforestry session at the Empire State Producers Expo. So thank you all for being here, for making a little bit of history. It's really great to have you. And I want to start things off by giving an acknowledgement of the land that is currently called New York State. And I am currently in what's known as Ithaca, New York, which is Gayagohono territory. And I'm affiliated with Cornell University. And Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayagohono, who are the Cayuga Nation. The Gayagohono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayagohono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayagohono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. This land acknowledgement that I just read has been reviewed and approved by the traditional Gayagohono leadership. And in addition to this acknowledgement, but also separate from it, it's important to acknowledge that Cornell's founding was enabled in the course of a national genocide by the sale of almost 1 million acres of stolen indigenous land by way of the Morrill Act of 1862. And to date, Cornell University has neither officially acknowledged its complicity in this, nor has it offered any form of restitution to the hundreds of Native communities impacted. I will talk a little bit more about this in a little bit, but also I encourage you to check out Cornell University's Indigenous Dispossession website if you're curious for more information. And I'm just showing here on this map, what is outlined in purple is the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee people. And included here, I want to say that some of the common names that we know them by, such as Cayuga or Seneca, Onondaga, etc. And so, yeah, you'll see here alternate spellings of these words. The names that you may commonly know are what they were given by English-speaking peoples, and the other names that you see are what we call endonyms, which are the names that they call themselves in their own language. And they're not perfect spellings. These are non-English words. And so this map is a work in progress. And also, pronunciation is not something I am trained in. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that these are, as we learn more about cultural competency, it's important to learn the names of the peoples by which they call themselves. And this is how things look today. The areas in purple are the current territories that are controlled and recognized by these nations. Some of them have been kind of exported to other countries, such as here Wisconsin. The Oneida Nation has a territory in Wisconsin, as well as Canada. As you can see, it's a much smaller proportion of land than originally they were occupied in. And this is also to say that these people are still here, and it's important that we acknowledge that and recognize that and work towards better relations as neighbors and occupiers on their land. As I briefly mentioned earlier, Cornell University has a very long history with this process. And while by the time that Cornell was established as a university, the Haudenosaunee dispossession had already taken place just by way of the New York State government, as well as the government of the United States and the colonies. However, Cornell University has profited and benefited from the sale of indigenous land elsewhere. And that's what this map shows, mostly in the Midwest, as well as in what is today California. And so if you want to learn more about this, it's a really fascinating and important story. I recommend going to landgrabu.org, which is where this story first broke in March 2020, as well as learning more about the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program at Cornell University. And how this all really relates to agroforestry is that a lot of research is recently coming out that is expressing our scientific understanding of how indigenous land practices have shaped the landscapes that we see today, and our understanding that agroforestry is an indigenous ingenuity. And this evidence is coming from all over the world. And here I have just a slice of this, which represents places like the Amazon, the Pacific Northwest, and even in parts of New York State today. And so everything that you're going to see in this presentation, while we are continuing to developing new takes on agroforestry, it is a technology and a relationship with the land that is deeply, deeply old. And I think all of our practitioners and researchers have an understanding of this, and it's something that we wish to highlight even more greatly and develop more connections with. Agroforestry also has been very recently recognized for its contributions to both the adaptation and mitigation of climate change. And I'm just going to very quickly, this figure comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their report that came out in 2019, not the most recent one, but very recent, which shows here very quickly that agroforestry and is able to, the darker colors in this matrix here, the darker the color means the more highly the potential it has been assessed to have. And so it has agroforestry as as a land management practice. It's assessed to have extremely high positive impacts on the mitigation and adaptation of climate change, as well as in terms of combating desertification, land degradation, as well as positively impacting food security. And you can also see it has a very low cost. And IPCC has given it an estimate of up to about 5.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in terms of the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent that it can sequester. And so this is really important. The agroforestry is not only something that can provide food, but can also help to not adapt to a changing climate, as well as help reduce the risk and exposure to that. And then this is from the most recent report, which just came out. This is in chapter 8. It says that in spite of various benefits of agroforestry, the expansion of existing areas of agroforestry and the establishment of new agroforestry systems has remained limited, mainly due to lack of institutional supports, lack of expert support to ensure adequate management, weak capacity for monitoring and regulation, and a lack of financial support. And so given all this challenge and promise that both the agroforestry has, I'm really extremely grateful that agroforestry has been included in this expo this year. And I'm really especially grateful to Dr. Steve Reiners, who's with us today, who has played a huge supportive role, not only in bringing all of us together, but just welcoming this topic into this expo. And also many thanks to the expo staff for all of the technical support they have been giving us. If you're interested in learning more about my work, I focus on growing nut trees in New York State. You can contact me here. My email is here, sfb42. And you can also follow me on social media at Research is Nuts.
Thank you, Samantha, for that introduction and for just setting a really nice tone in your intro there. I might go over a bit of the similar content, but I think I'll just be kind of building upon what you really laid out in your introduction. All right, well, I'm really excited to be here today and to share a little bit about the work I do. As Samantha said, I work with Cornell Cooperative Extension in Columbia and Greene counties at the Agroforestry Resource Center, which is located in Greene County, the Northern Catskills. So just a quick overview of my talk. I'm just going to briefly go over what agroforestry is, just so I'm not making any assumptions about people's knowledge. I'll share the work that the center does, a little bit of our history, and then a kind of a summary of the different layers of efforts that we engage in. So highlighting some national, regional, and local work, and then sharing a bit about what we do at a really local level with programming, demonstrations, and resource development. Okay, so first of all, by, I guess, USDA standards, agroforestry is defined as the intentional integration of trees and agriculture to meet, again, intentional conservation goals while building climate resilient, profitable systems. So in essence, to me, all of that wording really means putting the right plants or animals in the right location for the right reason. So letting the land really guide your management decisions. And there's many different forms that agroforestry can take when combining all these different systems. So it's been broken out into these 5 different practices or systems. So those would include silvopasture, which we'll hear more about later today from Brett. It also includes windbreaks, so using rows of perennial plants to reduce wind effects on crops. Riparian buffers, which can be fruitful and productive or just ecologically based. It also includes alley cropping, which is combining perennial and annual agriculture to reap the benefits of both. And then it also includes forest farming, which is the kind of world that I mostly live in. And that is farming under the canopy of an existing forest. And so as Samantha really beautifully laid out, agroforestry is nothing new. This is really rooted in indigenous knowledge, or it's also known as traditional ecological knowledges. And this is something that has been a part of indigenous culture in their everyday way of life for thousands and thousands of years. And I think it's great to, be able to revisit those historical practices and kind of bring them to light. And so I just had a few examples of different ways that agroforestry has existed for some time. So on the left here, we have traditional birch bark containers being made for maple sap. In the center, there is blueberry collection in a highly managed forest to encourage that crop to grow. And then on the right here, we have a graphic made by Colleen Rosier, who works with the Yurok and Kurok tribes in Northern California and has documented some of their traditional agroforestry systems by using fire, pruning, and other management practices to produce crops like acorns, huckleberries, mushrooms, and more. And that's all done both for their own consumption, but also to meet ecological needs. And so why use agroforestry? Why care about it? And there are just so many reasons. So I hope to just highlight a few. So in any farming endeavor, obviously economic benefits are important. So that is certainly one of the benefits of agroforestry. But it also comes with what might be equally important benefits, such as ecological and social. And I have just a kind of quick comparison. It's overly simplified, but I think it drives home a really great point, comparing monoculture systems, so just one crop in a field, to a more complex system, for example, an alley cropping system that has the perennial trees with annual crops in the middle. And this graph shows different benefits of different practices, of those two practices. And where you see the yellow bar extending higher up towards each of those benefits, it represents a greater benefit. So if we look at soil protection, for example, in a monoculture system, your soil protection is fairly low, almost non-existent, whereas in agroforestry systems, it's much higher due to the consistent coverage. And so if you look around that wheel, all of the spokes on that wheel kind of represent that in agroforestry systems, those benefits are greater: carbon sequestration, water quality protection, habitat enhancement. You'll note, though, the only place where the benefits aren't greater is workload reduction. So as these are intensive and sometimes complex systems, they often require much more labor up front, and then you're able to reap the benefits of the systems that you've created and are able to work with later. And so when you look at land use in New York State, we are a very heavily forested state, 61% forested, in fact, and that kind of breaks out to an acre per resident, which is quite a bit of forested land. And so, like I said before, agroforestry is really about putting the right practice in the right place. And so it's using what the land has to offer. And for us in New York, we're so lucky to have quite a bit of forested land to work with. And I think agroforestry allows us to place a higher value on that forested land. You'll note here that I mentioned 21% of farmland is actually forested. And so instead of maybe just paying taxes on that land, or perhaps even seeing it as a burden, or maybe just integrating, passive recreation or pulling firewood, there's so much more that can be done to enhance the quality of those forested systems and, receive some mutual benefits. And in addition to that, allowing our land to remain as forested and increasing the amount of trees in the ground only helps build our resilience to changing climate conditions. So more and more, as we're experiencing weather shifts, farmers are forced to shift their practices so they're not continued to be threatened by these weather events. And that's where agroforestry can really play a key role in increasing that resilience on the landscape. Okay, so I just wanted to give that background and set that tone. And so this is where I work for most of the time. This is the Agroforestry Resource Center, a part of CCE, Columbia Greene. It was founded in 2003, really to meet the needs of local residents who own a lot of forests. It's a very forested county. They're mostly small parcels, and people are interested in engaging with their land. And this just at the time seemed like the direction to go, and today it still does. And so that center is located in our Greene County location in the Northern Catskills, and is in combination with Sayusla Model Forest, which was a donated 142-acre teaching forest. It was at that time in 2003 that we merged with Columbia County, which really only furthered our mission in terms of implementing agroforestry. It was a nice balance that we found. Greene County is more forested, and while Columbia County does have beautiful forested lands, they have more agriculture happening on the landscape. So it was a really nice balance we were able to find with this programming. And while we are a local county organization, we engage nationally, regionally, statewide. This is a great instance, and locally. And so I look forward just to highlighting some of those partnerships and all the work that's happening through the country and in the state that you all could get involved with. So at a national level, I think it's important to note these two organizations or associations. So on the left here, we have the Association for Temperate Agroforestry, also known as AFTA. And so AFTA exists nationwide, and you can become a member or just passively engage with their educational materials. They put out a newsletter. They host a biennial national agroforestry conference, which hops kind of back and forth from coast to coast to try to increase accessibility for folks to attend. And they also house and sort of oversee regional working groups that exist across the country. So I just think it's important to note that it's not just happening here in the Northeast. This is countrywide that we're seeing agroforestry adoption happen, and it takes different forms based on what part of the country and what the climate is like there. And then another great partner and amazing resource is the USDA's National Agroforestry Center. And their work really focuses on research and science-based outreach. And through that research, they produce amazing tools that can be very supportive of land management decisions. And they engage with extensive partnerships, so they're not siloed. They partner with universities, nonprofit organizations, state, federal agencies, and farmers and practitioners as well. So honing in a little more locally on a regional level, we partner with many organizations, and I thought this would be a great opportunity to share a new project that's kicking off this year, which is called Climate Smart Agroforestry, a multi-regional training for technical service providers. This is a collaboration among many different partners. So it includes Interlace Commons out of the Northeast, Appalachian Sustainable Development coming from the Southeast, the Savannah Institute from the Midwest, and with the partner of the National Agroforestry Center. And we are all working together to improve agroforestry technical assistance around forest farming, alley cropping, and silvopasture. What's become really evident is that agroforestry education and adoption has been happening for the past decade or more. And these practitioners are starting to seek some help from technical service providers, NRCS, soil and water, all these other entities that they're used to engaging in through their farming endeavors. But a lot of those folks who work for those entities aren't very well oriented to agroforestry because it hasn't really been a part of their work. So we've sort of reached a little bit of a bottleneck where we have a lot of interest, a lot of energy building, and we want to make sure that there's nothing that will stop that momentum from moving forward. So through this partnership, we're going to be creating pretty robust demonstrations in each of those 3 different regions of the country. And we'll also be creating curriculum for practitioners, for technical service providers, and a special set of curriculum for NRCS staff as well. So we're really excited about this upcoming work, and you should be hearing about some training starting next year. All right, so even more locally, at a statewide level, we work with an amazing team. It's a Cornell work team called Agroforestry in New York State. The team formed a few years ago, and it is about 25 members from extension offices across the state, and we maintain a strong partnership with Cornell University. So we formed a few years ago with some goals that included just really assessing the awareness and adoption of agroforestry and furthering the outreach and education that we provide. It also seemed pretty evident that we were all doing this work in different parts of the state. So it was a way for us to not duplicate efforts and to really build off of each other's efforts. And you'll see in the image here, just a quick snapshot off of our website. These are the different topics or expertise that are housed in our team. And our website isn't really meant to house all of these resources. It's more of a directory. If you're interested in one of these topics, you can find a point person to talk to or resources to kind of kick off with your education. And so a little bit more about the work that team does in order to kind of just further understand or better understand where everyone's at with agroforestry. Instead of making assumptions about what people want to learn, we are currently launching a statewide survey. So this survey is to just do exactly that, get just an assessment of awareness and adoption. Who knows and understands what about agroforestry and who's practicing what different systems throughout the state. And so I would encourage anyone and everyone who works on land in New York State in any form to take this survey. And you can find it at our team's website, which is cornellagroforestry.org. That should be open for maybe another month or two. So I'd encourage you to get in there and fill it out. So in addition to that survey, the team also does webinars. It's a bi-monthly series that we started last year and it was really popular. So we're going to do it again this year. And the topics really range from beginner to advanced. So I'd encourage you just to check those out. And you can go onto that same website the survey's at to find out about that one. And if you're interested in staying tuned in to what we're working on, you can join our mail list. And I'll say we've got some members of the team on the panel today, which is great to see. All right, and then so at our Agroforestry Resource Center, I mentioned in the overview of the center that we house a 142-acre demonstration forest called the Sayusla Model Forest. That was graciously donated to us by a man named Eric Rasmussen, who stewarded this land as a New York State tree farm and a practicing forester since the early 1960s. It's a land that he loved and cared for and always open to the public. So he, as part of his legacy planning, donated that to us, and it's where we're able to practice and showcase a lot of these agroforestry techniques. So on site there, we do a ton of programming. Our office runs the spectrum of Cornell Cooperative Extension topics, but I'm just going to focus on the agroforestry related ones today. So in the world of forest farming, we work on mushroom identification, mushroom cultivation, ginseng production, general edible and medicinal plant workshops. And these are all offered to a range of audiences. Sometimes they're just general, open to the public, and other times they're more geared toward technical service providers, and yet other times they're more geared towards farmers looking towards enterprise planning. And in addition to those agroforestry focused programming, we also just do more general forestry. So my work is really rooted in forestry. And so we focus on forest health workshops, tree regeneration, mainly around deer browse limitations. And we also host a number of logger trainings. And so in addition to those local programs that we do, as I mentioned, we maintain and build demonstrations throughout that landscape. So there's a brochure and trails, and you can take kind of like a self-guided trail to see some of these different demos. But some of them include understory herbs, woodland mushrooms, maple syrup, which we're getting out of trees in the sap form right now, and some fruit and nut crop demos. And as I mentioned, with that regional partnership throughout the Northeast, Southwest, and Midwest, more robust demonstrations are being built. So Sayusla will house a more robust forest farming demonstration. We are expanding our shiitake laying yard to represent commercial production, and we're building a larger scale understory herb farm in the woods. And then in addition to those programs and demonstrations, we also do a bit of resource development. We engage in a series called Grow, Manage, Harvest, where we try to at least once a year put out a new guide to an agroforestry crop. So I've highlighted here our pawpaw guide. We also create some ginseng fact sheets, mainly around regulations that are oriented towards conservation. So just making sure that growers and people interested in ginseng are really rooted in those conservationally minded regulations. And then just a few others around some other agroforestry practices. We're currently creating a multifunctional riparian buffer guide. So that's building a buffer of plants along a waterway that is just filled with fruit, nuts, and any other kind of crops that you can think of that come from a plant. A wetland plant guide, which is hyper local to the Northern Catskills where we work, so we can all be really conscious of ecologically sensitive habitats. And then we also do a bit in the way of assessment tools, again, just to help people match the right crops to the landscape. And that is it for me. That was sort of a rapid fire overview of everything I do. And I think we do have a few minutes for questions, but thanks for listening to my talk.
Thanks so much, Tracey. That was, super interesting. I'm so excited for all the new developments happening. Can't wait to hear any future updates. Would love to see if anyone has any questions for Tracey at this time.
Thanks for sticking the survey link in there.
Yes, and please share that if you know other folks throughout the states, or is that the USDA one? I'm not sure which. There's both the USDA, there's both like nationwide and a New York State survey.
Yeah, the USDA is doing a nationwide one building off of the ag census, but this is just the statewide one.
Great. All right.
Well, if there are no questions, you'll just have to come visit. We're open to the public. Come for a walk.
So I'll be talking about hazelnuts, generally what it takes to get hazelnuts in the ground and growing. We're going to talk about all things about hazelnuts and what you can do with them. So an overview. Whoops, my advancer is not working. There. So we're going to talk about hazelnuts in general, how they're great for our unused hillsides to help regenerate the soil, and why you want to plant a hazel tree in the first place, what it takes to get them to grow properly, spacing, planting, propagation, and the economics of a hazelnut orchard, and what types of species and or cultivars are available. And then in the end, something that's near and dear to our heart, Samantha's very much involved with it as well, is a farmer cooperative we formed about 2.5 years ago to process all the nuts from hazelnuts as well as chestnuts and other native nuts. So I'm going to have a lot of slides. I'm going to go relatively fast, but I thought I'd spend a little time on the background so that you understand how I'm going to proceed through this talk. So hazelnuts are native to the region. I did not know that when I first moved on a hilltop overlooking Cortland, New York. And we saw the hillsides being filled in with scrub brush and, sumac, striped maple trees, the initial trees that take over the fields. We thought, what a waste. So we started planting trees of all different kinds, trying to find what trees would grow great in our region. And we quickly found out the chestnuts and hazelnuts grew well, and we learned they were native here to begin with. So, we were glad to find out we weren't fighting what nature already had intended. So we spent our time mainly on hazelnuts and secondarily on chestnuts. There was a lot of people working on chestnuts and almost nobody working on hazelnuts for our region. So we planted many thousands of hazelnuts, and we found that there had to be a hybrid between our native nuts, Corylus americana, with the Europeans, because the Europeans have done a really good job over the thousands of years developing the hazelnut to be thin-shelled, larger, and tasty. So the problem, though, with European hazels is that they are not cold hardy and die from our native blight we call Eastern filbert blight. So people have been trying to hybridize the two for over 100 years, as documented by the Northern Nut Growers Association. And our native hazels, in comparison to the European hazels, are much smaller. Our native hazels are like a bush, from a small to a large lilac bush, whereas the European hazels are often 25, 35 feet tall once they're very mature. So if you notice, most orchards, especially apple orchards, they're going towards smaller and smaller and smaller trees so they can have higher density, ease of harvesting and whatnot. So our native bushes are actually a good form for them to be in. And it turns out when you hybridize the two, they tend to be our bush size, but a little bigger. So for example, though, you can see our native nuts here are on the top. They tend to be much smaller and tend to have a thicker shell compared to the nuts down below. The nuts down below are not European nuts, but they are hybrid nuts, hybridized with the Europeans. They often can have the same size of nut and size nut meat and thinner shells. And this is what we've been working hard on at Z's Nutty Ridge for, since 1993. So we've been put a lot of effort into it, where we live and eat and breathe hazelnuts. And you'll see as we go through. All right, so I'm going to speed up a bit here, but to add what we were just given by Tracey, that 60% of the New York State is forested. It wasn't that way back in 1890. We went to the local library and went through the census. And at one point in the census, I think it was, 1890, 96% of all the land in Cortland County was cleared. And you can see in the picture above, the hillsides, as far as you can see, were cleared, except for some tree line and a few dotted trees here and there. And this is a drawing, which is supposed to be a rendering of what actually was seen in Cortland County back in 1890. Same picture down below, slightly different angle, but you can see where the hillsides have filled back in. They grew poor, eroded, and farmers stopped, farming them. So why hazels? Well, I call them nature's power plant. They, with this cultivars we'll be showing you, they can produce 2 times the oil of soybeans per acre. And the economics are quite nice. Also, hazelnuts are a known commodity to all the people. And people love, recently, in the last 10 years, there's been a groundswell of people wanting to source their food locally. And nuts are extremely healthy. Report after report after report constantly coming out that nuts are extremely healthy and should be part of the daily diet. And there's all kinds of good information. I won't read the stats, but bottom line is, one of the papers I read said that people who consume nuts 3 times or more a week die 20% less from all mortality causes across the board. And that's reason enough to be eating more nuts. Okay, so they're native already. So you know that our soil is already adapted for them. And I can go into details here, but basically they're like more neutral type soils. They can handle, 5.4, 5.8, won't grow as well as they could, but they like towards neutral. We have plenty of water natively in the area, at least 30 inches of rain a year. They are very happy. Last year we had a lot of rain. Year before last, we had a very dry year. They came through. Some trees are hurt a little, but otherwise they came through without any irrigation. And I already discussed the hybrids and the native trees can and need to be hardy. So fertilizing, the native trees really don't need much fertilizing. They can be amended with, mulch and manures. You can let them grow as a bush or as a single stem tree. There are maintenance guides along with the book that my wife and I have written, teaching you and showing you how to maintain the orchard. And it's actually fairly low impact compared to growing peppers or other annual vegetables. So hazels are wind pollinated, so you don't have to worry about bees. Bees help, no doubt, but hazels do not need wind. And to that extent, need to make sure you have good pollinating male flowers in your orchard. And so nowadays we recommend that you have 1 row out of 5 or 6 rows, no more than 1 out of 4 rows, be seedlings. And then the other whole rows be cultivars. And the neat thing is these flowers, you can see, they're teeny tiny flowers, size of a bud itself. You don't even notice them if you're more than like 10 feet away. They're receptive for 4 to 6 weeks. They'll sit there and wait and wait and wait for pollen to come along. So your main job is to make sure you have good pollen available. So when you plant hazels, they're small trees, as we already discussed. They're generally less than 3 feet, often 6 to 18 inches tall, especially seedlings, the first-year-old ones. The cultivars can be 2 to 3 feet tall. You can dig them by hand, but large numbers you often want to use like a tree transplanter. And we also suggest that because the bushes are so tasty to deer and rodents when they're young, before they develop a thick bark, we strongly recommend you put hardwood cloth around the trees, as well as a fence to deter the deer from trying to get in. And there's our transplanter that we use on our farm. So as far as spacing goes, you can go as close as 8 feet apart within a row. if you're planting an orchard, and we suggest you have at least 16 feet between rows, not more than 18 feet. If you just want to plant a hedgerow, you can plant as close as 3 feet for a quick privacy, but generally not more than 7 feet if you want, a true hedgerow. Like I said earlier, you can grow these in tree form. You can just let them grow as a single stem or a few stems. Natively, they want to grow as a 20, 30, 40 stem bush. We don't fully recommend that. The base of the bush gets very wide and a lot of nuts can drop down at the base. So it kind of hinders harvesting, but you can harvest them with a vacuum harvester if they're a bush or a tree. We don't go much into harvesting in this talk, but it's basically establishment of orchards. So like anything else, when you first plant it, to get the roots going, we suggest you water. Like I said already, you got to protect from rodents of all kinds. The other pests are Japanese beetles. You can spray, but basically beetle traps work best. Just stop them before they ever get started. You have to be careful when you mulch trees. You want to acidify the soil next to the trees, so you have to make sure you lime the trees from time to time. The other problem that we're starting to see now is big bud mite. It's really just getting started in our orchards. There are sprays, lime sulfur, as well as commercial sprays you can use to control big bud mite. Some trees are naturally resistant to big bud mite. So as long as you know how to avoid these issues, I think hazels are the next up and coming crop with a very bright future. So here's an orchard planted in 2017. We show the hardware cloth cages. Hang on a second. We show the hardware cloth cages and irrigation line that we've taken out. We only leave the hardware cloth cages on for a couple of years until the trees form a bark and they're not tasty to rodents. And the irrigation lines we pick up and move. Here is an orchard that's 1 year younger. It was planted in 2018. And you can see the plastic at the base of the trees where we're layering the trees. We're encouraging the suckers to form their own roots so we can split them off and form clones. It's one of our main jobs here at Nutty. So, I talk about just getting the hazelnuts established. The main thing the whole purpose of getting trees established as your core for agroforestry is to add all the other options that you have available to you. One potential co-op member joining our New York Tree Crops Alliance wants to herd ducks in his pasture. He says ducks are great grass eaters. He's been growing them for a long time, and now he wants to expand his duck operation through a hazelnut orchard. I'm tickled with that. And I did not see that described well in other agroforestry practices. So economics. If you just plant seedlings, you're going to get between 120 pounds to 1,300 pounds per acre. UMHDI found out. That's Upper Midwest Hazelnut Development Initiative. So you really can't plant just seedlings and expect to break even for your efforts. And that's when you plant 500 or 600 bushes to acre. They say overplant and eliminate 2 to 3 times or 2 or 3 trees per tree that you keep. They're great for pollination insurance, as already discussed. But the bottom line is, if you plant mainly cultivars, as I discussed, you can get 2,000 to 4,000 pounds per acre. Direct web sales, that's at $6 a pound in shell. That's 12,000 to 16,000 an acre. B2B sales, like straight to grocery stores and outlets, you're around $350, maybe a little more a pound now. That's 7,000 to 14,000 an acre. Commodity sales, like you're selling to Ferraro, just over the border so they can make Nutella and chocolate covered hazelnuts, you're only going to get $2,400 to $4,800 per acre. But that's way higher than any annual grain crop that you can grow. And here's a picture I love. It shows a plant that we just patented called Photon. Very round nuts, very short husks, very large nuts at that. And it produces like crazy. We harvested 22 pounds off this tree this last fall. And an orchard full of that would be well over 4,000 pounds per acre. And this was a good year last year. So you can't take that. You're not going to get that every year, but some years you're going to get, those kind of yields. So we talk about hybrid hazel cultivars. 5 years ago, there weren't any. Now we have 37. And what makes a good cultivar? So that keeps using the word. And cultivars, just keep in mind, are just clones of a very good parent mom tree. So you have to have EFB resistance. I told you that already because we're hybridizing with European trees. You need to make sure they maintain the local disease resistance. You need to make sure you're compatible with your zone. Make sure the tree is rated for your zone that you're in. Of course, nut quality, but there's a whole bunch of secondary other issues you have to worry about. Here's a chart. I already discussed half of it, but bottom line is you want the nuts to taste well. Some nuts can taste downright earthy. You don't want that. You want that nice hazelnut coffee flavor you expect, or that Nutella flavor. And another thing that people like, they like, well, actually commercial growers want this. They want nuts to blanch well. We found out that the pellicle around the nut is very healthy for you and maybe shouldn't be removed. But for confections, they like the blanch to take the pellicle off the nut. We already talked about big mud mite resistance. Roundness is an ideally confection thing, not for out of hand eating. Something we'll talk about is pollen compatibility. Not all trees, cultivars, will pollinate each other, but seedlings, if you have a row of seedlings, you don't have to worry about it. And pollen timing. It's somewhat of an issue, but not really. Flowers will sit there and wait for 4 to 6 weeks. And then genetic diversity, we want to maintain genetic diversity. That's another reason to have a row of pollinators. We want to find more cultivars, and a row of pollinators which are seedlings, will do that for us. So there are 33 identified different pollen types, identified by their alleles, S alleles at that. And 2 trees cannot have the same first S allele, otherwise they won't cross-pollinate each other. So if you plant a row of cultivars, all the same clone, you should plant a different clone in the next row and check their alleles, if available, to make sure they can cross-pollinate each other. But then again, if you have a row of seedlings, this is not an issue. But we just want to make you aware of the issue that you could have if you blindly plant all the same tree, which people are sometimes get so energetic, they just want to get trees planted and they don't double check themselves. So we actually have cultivars down to zone 3 being developed by UMHDI and at Greene Nursery, which is just over the border past Buffalo into Canada. They themselves are in zone 7, but they work with a Morden experimental farm in Manitoba, Canada. So they've found some very hardy native trees that are productive, and some are hybridized to, and they were lucky to maintain that hardiness while getting larger nuts. So in 4 or 5, we have another grouping of trees that are good. Also from Greene, ourselves at Nutty Ridge, and a couple other nurseries are reselling what's been developed by the Hazelnut Consortium, which is a network of colleges, University of Nebraska, Oregon State University, and Rutgers University, and Arbor Day Foundation. So these, it's called the consortium trees. They're being released and grown by some nurseries, including ourselves. God darn it. And then zone 6 and 7, these again are Greene's, Foggy Bottom reselling Rutgers, and ourselves are selling one of Rutgers releases called Hunterdon, along with Foggy Bottom. So at our nursery, I'll highlight what we have, and I'll show you the other nurseries and where they're located next. We sell one cultivar called Grand Traverse, and I have over on the right column when they're available this spring, or we have to wait till next fall because we're growing them out. The Beast was a consortium released, very aggressive growing tree. It's going to be a taller tree, produces like crazy, very nice nuts. Hunterdon is the Rutgers release, very nice European. It's actually European that's been bred to have EFB resistance. Nika is our own release for Edzie's Nutty, phonetically named after our New York Tree Crops Alliance. Truxton's another release that we sell that we have here. Photon is the one I just told you we just filed a patent on, beautiful tree. And Geneva, which was formed by Cornell professors back in the 40s and 50s. It's an okay tree, not quite cold hardy enough, but it's an okay tree. And then we sell seedlings. Out of the 10,000 trees that we grown to maturity over many years now, we have 8 trees that we sell seeds from, only good trees out of 10,000. So that's a hint on seedlings. So from 7 trees we sell the nuts from. Cortland is seeds only from Nika. Nika has very thin shells, and it passes that those characteristics onto many of its seedlings. So we name that separately. Then prodigies are controlled crosses that we use from our best trees, and we give the growers a chance to find the next generation cultivar. So in blue are regional nurseries that you can get seedlings as well as some cultivars from. Foggy Bottom, Ontario, which is Green Nut. Twisted Tree, which is in Spencer, New York, St. Lawrence Nursery, like it sounds, and ourselves located here in Cortland, New York. So we got all these people growing nut trees, and we needed a cooperative to process this nuts and sell the nuts and process them sanitarily with quality in mind, and hopefully brand building so people can recognize the efforts of the growers. So we believe that a co-op will be environmentally sustainable use of all the fallow lands, which we discussed in our motivations for growing trees in the first place. And the nurseries themselves will expand farming, enable people to start farming that haven't been able to farm, as our native hillside lands are dirt cheap compared to many farmlands throughout the nation. And as an example, acreage for hazelnuts in Oregon are going for $20,000 an acre. So we can get hillside land around here for $1,500 an acre if you buy it a little bit. And the unfortunate aspect of that is eventually it'll do such a good job economically. I bet you it'll increase tax revenue. It'll allow exports. And of course, we hope agritourism. A couple more slides and we're done. I got to be running out of time. So the co-op will oversee the marketing, the sales, the branding, the sanitary processes and procedures. You need kitchen and storage certification for your nuts, clean, shell, and roast the nuts, as well as, went a little too fast, as well as do all the value-added processing. We're working with Tompkins CCC for agroforestry that got cut off. We have a grant. Thanks to Samantha for highlighting this potential grant to us. We will be introducing people to agroforestry, monitoring agroforestry practices, as well as develop value-added products and purchase the equipment needed for those value-added products. So you can see where the big circle here is where we plan to be immediately as far as servicing farmers. Ultimately, we'd love to see the cooperative be able to service all throughout the region. And here's some references, should you need them, to go look up data on UMHDI, ourselves. Different presentations have been done in the past, cooperative extension bulletins, the work of Tom Molnar, Dr. Molnar at University of Rutgers, and a book we like, Growing Nuts in the North. So I'm glad we were able to give this presentation, and we appreciate the attendance.
Thank you so much, Jeff. There's been quite some discussion happening in the chat. Wondering if you have a couple minutes to answer a couple questions.
Yep.
In particular, people are very curious about the truffles.
Yes.
And if you know of anyone who's actually currently doing that, if these are if you know anything about the species of truffles that people are using. Yeah, that's one set of questions.
I can speak a little bit to that. There is a Finger Lakes truffle farm. And I think you can search on the internet quick enough to find it. They started this like 7-8 years ago. I'm not sure what trees they're actually growing, but they're starting to harvest truffles. If you go to the Facebook page, you'll see the lady holding her handful of truffles, which is wonderful. It's something we always wanted to do. Last year, we contacted a company in North Carolina who will gladly inoculate the trees. You have to inoculate the roots of the trees before you plant them. I don't know what truffles she's growing, but for some reason, burgundy's popping up in my head. So I'm not sure, but yes, people are growing truffles in New York State.
Amazing, thank you. Another person is asking has a particular question about hazelnuts. They said that they are in zone 4. They have 3 hazelnut bushes that are 10 years old and no nuts. What do you suggest?
You need colder, hardier trees. A lot of times the trees will grow just fine, but the flowers and the male and female flowers won't survive the winter. So the tree grows fine, but no fruit. So you need to procure some colder, hardier trees, either St. Lawrence, myself, at our nursery, or even a kiva, twisted tree. They can provide trees for you.
Is it possible to that three hazelnut bushes alone may not be enough to actually get proficient wind pollination?
No, not at all. Hazelnut bushes should be fine for providing pollination.
Okay, great. So Sue is continuing to ask questions, and I encourage you to stay tuned to the very end where we can have more of a discussion with our presenters. Anna is now also asking if you can help, if pruning trees would help increase nut production. Do you know much about pruning effects on?
So I presented at Rutgers University a few years back, and there was the representative for Ferraro. Ferraro buys 65% of the world's commercially sold nuts. So they're the gorilla of the marketplace. And he said, the science is settled, Jeff. Nut trees produce more nuts than nut bushes. In this case, he was talking hazelnut bushes. And I was a little surprised to hear that. In Turkey, they grow them as semi-bushes. They grow them like 4 or 5 stems. So it's a tight base. And I think ultimately that's where we're going to end up, because if you let the bushes grow for 20 years, the base of the bush is 3 and 4 feet wide, and over the row harvester will just knock a lot of the seeds down into that entangled, bush. So I think Turkey's figured it out. They have small orchards, 4 to 15 acres, and they got it. I think that's what we'll end up adapting.
Howdy, everyone. So Samantha just said, I work as a regional extension forester, and yet the other full-time job outside of extension is our family has a large grass-fed beef operation. We graze about 500 acres here on the west side of Watkins Glen and lease a few hundred acres more from neighbors for hay production. So I like to talk about forestry stuff. I like to talk about cows, and when I can talk about them both together, that's like the best of both worlds for me. So I think this topic of silvopasturing fits in nicely to everything else we're talking about this afternoon, because I think a silvopasture is kind of the canvas, and then we can build all of these other agroforestry systems into it. So the conversation around silvopasturing really started a little over 20 years ago. Cornell, several colleagues of mine, Tatiana Stanton, who's our small ruminant specialist, Peter Smolage, he's our state extension forester, and some other folks did this Northeast SARE funded project at Cornell's Arnott Teaching and Research Forest, which is, today I'm the forest manager at the Arnott. It's a part-time duty. And they were looking at the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of using livestock, particularly goats, to control problematic forest understory vegetation. And the summary of the project was, yes, managed correctly, livestock could be a useful tool to do that. It was quite labor intensive. And I think that's where it would be a challenge for many livestock farmers that are just, they may very well work full time on the farm, but they still have other things like full-time jobs to keep them busy. So this project came to an end. And when I joined Extension in 2007, there were a lot of lingering questions from everybody, like, hey, I remember the goats in the woods. Can I do that with my cattle? Can I do it with my sheep? And of course, foresters were asking about this. And so we decided to formally start talking about silvopasturing. In fact, our very first talk was over at where Tracey works there at the Greene Columbia Agroforestry Center. I remember it was the most perfect day in June, a Saturday, that we picked for this talk. In other words, the absolute worst time imaginable to try and get a audience full of farmers, and yet we had a basically standing room only crowd that wanted to come hear about silvopasturing, and it just kind of mushroomed from there. So why do we get excited about silvopasturing today? Well, if you look, and this is a aerial image from just north of our farm here in Watkins Glen, you can see that our farmland is really this kind of mix of woods and mix of fields or pastures. And statistically, New York is about 2/3 covered with forests, and yet throughout most of our agricultural regions, it's about a 50-50 mix. And these are statistics that are a compilation of various reports and sort of expert consensuses, but I'm not going to cite them, but we estimate that we have about 3 million acres of this former agricultural land, which is usually either today in an invasive shrub complex or farm woodlots that have been either mismanaged over time, what we call high graded, or there was storm damage or some significant loss to some pests like emerald ash borer. And then we also have what's called underutilized grasslands and pastures. So it's not like if we're looking to make a difference in terms of rural economic development and adding to our self-sufficiency as a state or a region to grow more food in our backyard, this is something that has the potential to do it at a scale of, not just a few thousand acres, I mean, literally millions of acres. And it's important to recognize too, though, that this opportunity for silvopasturing can be approached from either of these two directions. We can be enhancing our pastures and our existing grazing lands by introducing trees. And all of you joining in today, I'm sure, are experienced tree planters and recognize that there's a little more to this than just digging a hole and putting a tree in the ground, walking away from it. In fact, I consider it the more challenging side of establishing silvopastures. But then we have, again, this very significant acreage of just either farm woodlots that are kind of not as much as they could be because of pests or pest management, and these farm plantations. So regardless of which of these two directions we're starting from, the goal is this image that you see in the middle, which is getting quality forages and quality functional trees, and then this herbivore component, which makes it unique from these other agroforestry systems, all working together in a synergistic fashion. And back when I was in forestry school 30 some years ago, it was ingrained into our young forestry minds that thou shall not put livestock in the woods. And I can talk about where that kind of European forestry model came from. And really it was good advice, though, when we started trying to shift farmers' thinking away from using their woods as the kind of the sacrifice paddock on the farm. And you can still see plenty of this on the landscape, and wooded areas that are being treated, again, where you put the animals when it's too hot or too cold or too muddy or the good ground's planted. And when you have this unmanaged, or I should say sort of like continual unmanaged grazing in these areas, you see these symptoms illustrated here of denuded soil erosion, exposed roots, decline in the health and vigor of the trees that are blowing over because of compromised root systems. So, but silvopasturing is a completely different beast. And first and foremost, it is intensive rotational grazing. This is an aerial image of our farm, just the home farm portion outlined in purple. And it's about a 200-acre farm. And what I want you to see here, though, is that this is a fairly dated map, but even back probably a dozen years ago when I did this map, we already had our farm chopped into 50 different paddocks that averaged a few acres in size. And across the 500 acres that we're currently grazing, that's divided into almost 130 paddocks. So our herd is constantly on the move. I'm not going to get into the details today of just how we do our rotational grazing. I will say that it's adaptive management. So sometimes we're moving multiple times a day. Sometimes we may only move every 2 or 3 days. But what this allows us to do is really increase density, so we can put a lot of animals in a small paddock for a short period of time. They eat the best third to half of what's there, but they pound and trample the rest of it, which kind of, again, levels the playing field. So you're not just having them selectively graze the good stuff and they ignore the woody invasive plants or the weeds. They trample and smash and knock down a lot of those plants, and in the process fertilize it well. It's not, most livestock is not going to defoliate the undesirable plants to the point where it's really going to make any difference at all. We do this year round, so we're grazing about 8 months of the year, and then we are feeding round bales for the other 4 months of the year. And we, as soon as the ground freezes up, which this year wasn't really until the 1st of January, we try to shift gears and feed as much of that hay as possible in our silvopasture paddocks, not feeding bales in the same spot over and over so that it smothers tree roots and harms the trees. What we're trying to do is put these, friend of mine, Joe Orifice, who's another forester, like silvopasturing, calls them bale bombs, and you put these round bales in these patches of soft brush. So on top of the multiflora rose canes or the honeysuckle or the barberry, these things that normally you just wouldn't be able to control with grazing and defoliation. And if you do the math, when you put 20 hungry cows around one of these bales in that 30-foot diameter circle, it's 1.5 million pounds of density per acre, which is far more than we can achieve during the grazing season. And it not only really puts a beat down on this bad brush, but it also fertilizes it, leaves a lot of viable seed there. So you get this little oasis of lush herbaceous growth the following year, which in turn helps suppress the growth of the woody invasives. And it's not a once and done deal. So you may have to do this multiple times over maybe the course of a decade or more, but each time you do it, it's setting it back just that much more. So why do we do silvopasturing? Well, for one thing, it allows us to use our whole farm, not just the half that doesn't have trees on it, but we really think of it as a way of rehabilitating our woods. Much of our woodland understory on the farm was dense invasive shrubs or native species like beech brush. And I won't go into all the forestry reasons today why we don't like that, but it's just, we wanted a healthier, more productive, more attractive woods. And we felt that we could still have all the benefits of the woods, but use it to support our grazing operation as well. And we could take any one of these bullet points here and talk about for the rest of the afternoon. Here's one that wasn't on that list, and kind of an obvious one. It's like we can be growing multiple things on the same site. And there's a pile of some of our locust posts and one of our locust walnut plantation silvopastures. And we have literally harvested tens of thousands of dollars of locust fence posts over the years from locust trees that we planted here 30 years ago. If you're into carbon, and we all should be as farmers today, then this is like the top land-based system for capturing and storing more carbon. And I've done some defensible calculations for our own farm, and our silvopastures, whether it's a plantation silvopasture or a woodlot silvopasture, I estimate that we're growing and I don't know about the storing part, but somewhere between 50 and 100% more carbon per acre as silvopasture versus just woods or just open pasture. And you may have noticed their resilience. I think that's really resilience and regenerative should be our two main focuses today. This is a photo of a 2011 drought on our farm, and these pictures were taken a week apart. So you can kind of see the dusty, dry, brown, burnt up conditions there that was taken around the 4th of July. And then a week later, the cows are up to their backs in lush green stuff. And we also use an adaptation of this we call living barns. So these are more coniferous type plantations on the farm. We're still thinning them out, trying to really promote tree growth and vigor, but we're not as keen on trying to thin it out to the point where we're growing a lot of forage underneath. We have 6 of these areas scattered around the 500 acres, and we just watched the 10-day forecast, and when the big storms come in like it did here a few weeks ago, we've got these areas well stocked with bales for a few days, and these are areas that are on well-drained soils. They got water nearby, and the cows are snug as a bug in a rug, riding out the worst of the winter weather in these areas. So if you'd like to learn more about this, we've been slowly compiling a number of different resources over the years. These are some things you can find on the Cornell Cooperative Extension Forestry extensions site, the forestconnect.info. We've got things like these sort of site evaluation tools. They're, to me, it would be a logical starting point if you're thinking about doing silvopasturing. We have a silvopasture management plan template, which you could share maybe with your forester to help you do some more formal planning. We have this Silvopasture forum here. It currently has about 600 members, and we understand you're not going to go on every evening and post stuff and read all the good stuff that's archived there. But if you join this, and when we do a big event related to silvopasturing, we will message the members. So I'm talking like 2 or 3 times a year, but you won't miss out on something important like this here. And I'll close out using this opportunity to invite you all to our Silvopasture tour, which will be September 15th and 16th. And we will be putting more details up soon on the forum. So that's all.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Brent.
In addition to my work with Extension and the education and outreach that I do around forest farming and mushroom production, I also own a small forest farm growing mainly shiitakes, managing about 300 bolts or so. So this is a favorite topic of mine, so I'm happy to step in. And I'm excited to talk to you about mainly shiitakes. We'll talk a little bit about some other mushrooms, but you'll see as I go on in my talk why the focus is on shiitakes. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of like fungus as an organism. I know many of us work with plants and animals, and there's been a lot more interest in mycology, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, I'll introduce shiitakes, share some growing considerations that you might want to think through if you are contemplating cultivating this mushroom. And then we'll get into some more specifics on exactly how the cultivation works and how you manage your bolts. And we'll talk a little bit at the end about scaling up and what enterprise building around this crop looks like. Okay, so sometimes I use the word like fungus and mushroom interchangeably, but just to clarify, mushrooms are the fruiting body of the fungus. So like an apple on an apple tree, they come out seasonally at certain parts of the year, and mushrooms engage in asexual reproduction using spores. So a regular mushroom has a cap. On the underside, it has gills where it produces spores. It has a stem that's called a stalk or a stipe. And then you see the underground section of the mushroom is coming from the fungal organism, the mycelium, and individual threads of that mycelium are hyphae. And mushrooms are, of course, decomposers in our natural world. And so this is just a nice close-up of mycelium in action, where you can see those individual threads of hyphae. I believe this is winecap stropharia cultivating wood chips in a jar before they were planted out into a field. So just a little bit of history about shiitake. Similarly to all of the other agroforestry practices that we've talked about, this is nothing new. Shiitakes have been cultivated for thousands of years. They're native to Japan, China, and Korea. And the word shi means tree and take means mushroom. So it's literally a tree mushroom. And shiitakes are weak pathogens, meaning that they're not too competitive out in the natural world. So they struggle on their own to gain a foothold in a decomposing log. And so they're not native to our ecosystem. And without intentional cultivation, you won't find them growing in the woods because of that weak pathogen piece. And they are saprophytes, so they live and grow on dead cut wood. And so mushroom identification is pretty important. Like I said, when you're intentionally growing shiitakes, they will grow much better and colonize that log really well. But just a quick overview, the cap is like a light to dark brown and it often has white specks on it. The gills, the underside, are really light, like white to a very light brown, and the stem is the same color. And maybe the most important feature is the spore color. So the image here you see is a spore print, and that's just the cap of a mushroom with the stem cut off, placed on black paper with a bowl or something over that mushroom cap to reduce wind flow. And those spores just fall out onto the black paper and leave the spore print. And so we can clearly see white colored spores, which is a great identifier. And maybe just as important as knowing the mushrooms that you eat is knowing their poisonous lookalikes. So this is Galerina, also known as deadly Galerina. And it's perhaps maybe the only wild mushroom in our ecosystem that could be confused with shiitakes. They do also grow on dead wood and have like a brownish color to them. The main difference is the spore color. They have a rusty sort of brown spore. So if you're ever in doubt, just let it sit on a piece of paper and double check the spore color. They're very different though. Once you get to know the mushrooms, it's easy to see many other features that distinguish the two. And so mushrooms have really similar needs to plants and even to us humans. So they obviously need food. There are brown rot mushrooms versus white rot, whether they consume cellulose or lignin, the components of that downed wood. They need water. They need to breathe air. Mushrooms actually take in oxygen and emit CO2 just like us. They do need light. Many people think that mushrooms just grow in the dark. And while they do need to be protected from direct sunlight in some cases, they do require a light cycle to produce. So in addition to protection from direct sun, they also need protection from wind, pests, and predators, just like any other crop. And so in essence, in a very simplistic way, this is the process for shiitake cultivation. You fell a tree, you inoculate that freshly felled tree. It has to incubate for a period about 12 months. And then it starts going through this cycle of forcing it to fruit, harvesting, potentially processing and selling, allowing a shorter incubation period to happen, and then continuing on in that loop for 4 or 5 years, maybe more, with the same piece of wood. So we're going to dive into that a little bit more detail. All right, so if you're thinking about growing mushrooms, the first thing you'll have to do is figure out where you can source your wood. And again, since we live in the Northeast and have so much forested land, it's not terribly difficult, but it can be a bit of a stumbling block, especially for people who maybe don't own woods or aren't comfortable using a chainsaw, which is just fine. So there's some other options for sourcing. And there's still a lot of current work happening to improve the sourcing process. So there is potential to buy logs from another landowner or even from land managers such as loggers. And so shiitakes like to grow on pole-size hardwood species, primarily oak, sugar maple, sometimes red maple, beech, hornbeam, and it can be grown on other species like birch. And so This is where I think shiitakes tie in with the bigger picture of agroforestry, because for me, the most appealing component of growing this crop is the opportunity to manage your woodlands and improve the health of your woods. So oftentimes for shiitake growers, they'll engage in timber stand improvement projects. So that's looking at the landscape as a whole and choosing trees that could be thinned out to improve what's left there. And you can often find great opportunities to use that pole-sized wood that's harvested through the timber stand improvements to then grow your crop on. And for harvesting the trees, you can really harvest them at any time of year, but there was some research done at Cornell that showed that winter and like spring after the sap flow is done are really the ideal times. You'll receive the highest level of production of shiitake mushrooms from bolts that are harvested during those windows. But as you can see from the chart, it's potentially a lower output from logs harvested in the summer and fall, but they're still quite productive. I think this really is more of a key piece to look at when you're considering more of a commercial level production. And so when thinking about sourcing, if you are engaged with other people sourcing the wood on your behalf and purchasing the bolts from them, there's a pretty steep learning curve when compared to something else like cutting logs for timber or firewood. The most important part of the bolt or the piece of wood that you're growing shiitakes on is that the bark is intact. So it can't be skidded out and dragged on the ground like much of the other wood that we source from our landscape. So a lot of communication and relationship building kind of needs to happen up front with those relationships. And so once the tree is cut and it's bucked up into sections, it turns into a bolt. So a bolt is just a piece of wood that you've decided to grow mushrooms on. They have some sort of standardized dimensions that are really developed around growing considerations, such as ease of handling to pick up and move these pieces of wood and soak them and manage them. So they're typically 4 to 6 inches in diameter. They can be a little larger, but they shouldn't be too much smaller. And they're generally about 3 to 4 feet in length. And so this creates a manageable log with enough food for the fungus to consume. So after you've sourced your wood, you need to work on identifying spawn and wax to inoculate the wood. And so there's a few different spawn suppliers. There are more and more popping up, but here are just a couple that I wanted to highlight that are fairly popular and pretty reliable companies. So you can make spawn at home. Sawdust or plug spawn is what's used to inoculate shiitake bolts. So it'll be sterilized sawdust that's colonized with the mycelium, or like wooden dowels that are used in construction that are also colonized with the mycelium. And generally at a production level, we're looking at using sawdust spawn. It's much more economical. And so you can make that at home by creating some sterilized conditions and introducing the mycelium and letting it colonize the sawdust. But I have to say, purchasing from some of these reputable suppliers, you'll find much more vigorous spawn that will produce a lot better than what I can make at home anyway. And so when you're choosing your spawn, there's a few different options for strains of shiitakes. And this is where I think it's really interesting when considering climate shifts. So typically a wide range spawn strain is used, and wide range shiitakes will fruit from about May to September when temperatures are averaging, at least 70 degrees up to the high 80s. So they're like the pretty standard strain that's used in production. But there are 2 other options that can really help extend and create a more consistent growing season. So cold weather strains can be used to extend the growing season and produce more shiitakes on the shoulder seasons. So as winter is shifting into spring and as fall is shifting into winter, these logs will fruit actually on their own without any forcing. So you'll get a nice extension there beyond the typical wide range season. And then warm weather strains are actually gaining popularity, and they're turning out to perform pretty well in the height of summer when we're seeing consistent high temperatures like above 90. At that level, the wide range spawn will sort of shut down. And so the warm weather can pick right up and kind of fill that gap that you might have in your production. And then the other piece of material that you have to source is wax. And that can be purchased from spawn suppliers. And it's a food grade wax, like not the wax you use to make candles, but like a cheese wax. All right, and so we can dive into the process of inoculation. And this graphic just shows that inoculation processes really have like three main stations. It's drilling, inoculating with the spawn, and waxing over the holes. Oops, a little too fast there. All right, so for the inoculation piece, you drill the holes, and you'll see here in this image at the top corner that we're using an angle grinder drill instead of a standard conventional drill. The angle grinder has a lot more power and higher rotations, so you'll find very quickly if you're using the two side by side that the angle grinder is the tool you want to use. You're able to drill those holes so fast without a lot of effort. And you can actually buy custom drill bits that are the right diameter and depth that will match your inoculation tool. And that is what you see on the bottom corner here. That piece of wood and metal sitting on the bowl is the inoculation tool. It's sort of like a plunger, and you stab it into your spawn and it fills up, and then you align it over the hole you drilled in your log and fill that hole with the spawn. And then finally you wax over that hole with your food grade wax to seal in moisture and protect the spawn from rodents or birds that might like to eat it. So after you have your inoculated bolts, you need a place to put them. And this place is called a laying yard. So at this time you would set up your laying yard and start thinking about management. So you need to just have a few features of that yard. A water source, so you're able to maintain hydration for those bolts. Year-round shade. And that could exist from a natural canopy cover of evergreens, or it may need to be supplemented like you see in the photo here with some ag shade cloth, like an 80% shade cloth is great. And then that area where you're keeping your logs needs to be relatively protected from the wind. Again, it's a moisture management piece. Your logs can't dry out. So if it's in a high wind situation, you might be spending more time to manage that moisture, or you might be losing some logs from your production if they get too dry. And then the other piece is pests and predators that we'll talk about a little bit later, but is not too substantial. So there's a couple different ways to organize your laying yard, and you'll find through this talk that like any other farming endeavor, shiitake cultivation offers a lot of room for innovation and problem solving. And so with that, there's a bunch of different ways you can set up your yard. On the left here, you see a crib stack system, and that's where the logs are just crisscrossed with airspace between them so the fungus can breathe. And this is an area that is protected from the wind, so we can stack vertical and not worry too much about wind pressures. And the image on the right there you see is a hillside method where they're stacked very low, so that's more suitable to a higher wind scenario. And then as you're laying your logs and letting them rest, they need about 12 months for an incubation period. And so while you're waiting through that incubation period, you can work on your fruiting plans for the next season. This is my backyard shiitake log production. And as I was setting it up, I kept wide paths between each stack of bolts, so I can drive a tractor mower with a trailer through the rows. And you'll see in the back of that picture, a livestock tank. It's like a 150-gallon tank that I'm able to put on the trailer of the tractor. And so I can drive the tanks to my shiitake bolts when I'm managing them for water or forcing them to fruit. And then I can drive the tractor to the fruiting racks where I can lean up the logs. So I'm not having to carry really heavy logs all around all the time. And so here's a couple different examples of what a fruiting rack can look like. And it can be super simple, like the top left corner where you see bolts just leaning against a pine tree. That bottom left corner, they're leaning against welded wire fence. In the center, there's like a fruiting rack that was built with a piece of wood, a branch that's just attached to the trees on either side. And then on the far right, there's just simply rope that's been secured to trees so the logs can lean on those. So after your logs are inoculated and set up in their laying yard, you need to wait through that incubation period, or what's also called the spawn run. The shiitakes need to fully colonize that piece of wood before they'll start fruiting. You can actually see in the picture on the left, looking at that cut end of the bolt, all that white, that's actually the mycelium actively colonizing the log. So then after about 12 months have passed from your inoculation date, those logs are ready to be forced to fruit. And this is what, in my opinion, makes shiitakes like the most optimal crop, is you can force them to fruit and harvest exactly when you want them or need them. So you soak them in cold, clean water for 12 to 24 hours. Not much longer than that, the logs will reach 100% moisture and the fungus will not be able to breathe and it will drown and die. And so here's just a quick example of what a fruiting schedule might look like. So this is considering perhaps you have 7 different stacks looking at this graphic, and you can see in May and June numbers 1 through 7. Those numbers represent a stack of logs. So, you know, there could be anywhere from 10 to 20 or maybe even 30 logs per stack. So the first week of May, when temperatures start averaging around 70 degrees, you're ready to start forcing your logs to fruit. So you could soak your first stack the first week of May. And then after they fruit, about a week later, they're laid back down to rest again. And then 7 weeks later, which would bring you to the second week of June, those very same logs are ready to be fruited again. You can actually fruit them up to 3 times in one season if you start off right at the beginning of May. And so those individual logs can be fruited 3 times a year and can be fruited for 4 or 5 seasons. And when thinking about harvesting time, there's really an optimal window for picking your shiitake mushrooms. So the images you see on the left side show on the underside of the mushroom, the cap still has a lip on it. And that's when you want to harvest. That's when you'll have optimal shelf time and optimal taste. The image that is second to the right is starting to flatten out a little bit. And I would still consider that, you know, maybe acceptable for sale, but once it gets to the image on the right, which is what I call pancake, that's something that I would not consider selling to my customers, but is perfectly fine to consume yourself. All right, and I did mention some pests. And while this list might seem like there's a lot of potential pests, really the main one that I hear most growers and myself, I have issues with are slugs. So slugs really like to eat mushrooms, and in your laying yard, it's this high moisture managed scenario where slugs can really start to take over. So you can do some things to reduce those impacts. I think the best cure, which I've highlighted here, is to harvest quickly. Don't let those mushrooms just sit on the logs if they're ready to be taken off. And then in terms of reducing the slug population, you can rake or remove some of the leaf duft that's below your logs. So you kind of remove that habitat. You can elevate your logs off the ground so the butts of those logs are not in contact with the soil. And I've seen a lot of interesting solutions using things like tarping or copper wire. And I think any effort makes a big difference there. In terms of these other pests, like I mentioned, if you don't wax the holes over, slugs or rodents might want to consume that mycelium, but I haven't seen much impacts on the mushroom itself, except for one grower that I've heard has a deer that's taken a liking to his shiitakes and kind of keeps coming back. But besides that one instance, I haven't heard much impacts from deer pressure. And then after they're harvested, you can store them in breathable bags in their refrigerator. They'll keep for quite some time. There are drying options for long storage. If you are looking to sell, they cannot be dried the way I have them here on my picnic table. They do need to be processed in a commercial kitchen. And like any mushroom, they need to be cooked before you eat them. And in terms of scaling production, you know, like a lot of crops, you can start small. So you can have just a few bolts, kind of get a handle on the process. And if it's something that you enjoy doing, you can start to scale up to meet your production needs. The main piece with this is that you have to wait a full year for that incubation period. So it does take, you know, a bit of planning ahead. And you can see here with some scalable pictures, the bottom is, you know, soaking in those tanks like I have. And the top is using a pond where you can really do a high volume. I'm just not sure exactly how we got them out. And so shiitakes grown on logs are really a specialty crop. They can be advertised using like that timber stand improvement piece as a real strong marketing piece. And they're sold at about $10 to $16 per pound. 10 is more of the wholesale, and 16 is more of the retail. I have a picture here of some advertising that I did for my home production where I generally sell them for $14 a pound. And Steve Gabriel did some great work through a New York Farm Viability Project for enterprise planning and documented and found through some research that about 1,000 log operation will net $10,000 annually. So people that are thinking about like a larger scale commercial production generally are trying to reach that number of 1,000 logs. But along with that work through the Farm Viability Project came some great development of like budgeting and marketing and a lot of supporting materials to help navigate that. And there are a few voluntary certification programs. I don't see many growers interacting with them, but there's just the general certified organic and also certified naturally grown. And so while shiitakes should be the center crop because of their reliability throughout the season, once you establish a mushroom production and have clients, it makes sense to start looping in other mushrooms that can't be forced to fruit as reliably. So when they flush, you can just add them into the mix and hopefully sell them through those same avenues. On the left here, we have golden oysters that are being fruited on a downed aspen with wedges that were cut out and then packed with spawn. In the center, we have winecap stropharia, which grows out of wood chips and soil. And on the right, there's a beautiful lion's mane fruiting off of a beech in a totem stack. So a vertical log with a cookie cut off, packed with spawn, put back on and incubated for a year or two. Okay, and there's just a couple resources, just our website at CCE Columbia Greene. My Woodlot's a local entity that houses some great woodland resources, Cornell Small Farms, and then the bottom is a best management practices for, oh, there's a typo, for log-based shiitake cultivation, which is a phenomenal resource. And thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Tracy, for that incredibly detailed tour through growing mushrooms. Really fantastic. We had a couple of questions in the chat. One is about nutrition, and the person asked if waiting to harvest, so when you maybe get towards that pancake stage, is there, do we know anything about any change in the nutritional quality of the mushrooms?
Not to my knowledge. I believe that they would still have the same nutrition in the mushroom, but I wonder with the flavor reducing, I think that they themselves just start to decay. All the same components are still there.
Right, okay. And there's another really fascinating question about possible use of invasive trees, and if there's been any models for growing mushrooms on ailanthus trees or tree of heaven.
Yeah, so at first with emerald ash borer coming through, everyone was trying to grow different mushrooms on ash trees without a lot of great success. And I am not sure about ailanthus. Don't have an answer to that, not to my knowledge, but I would love to hear if someone's found success with that.
Yes, we need more research.
And I see the other question is about ash, so there we go.
Great, and also, I don't know if you can speak really briefly about just shiitake nutrition in general, what the, as far as a food source, some of the highlights of their nutritional components?
Sure, yeah, they have a lot of micronutrients. I'm not much of a nutritionist myself, but like many mushrooms, they're pretty high in proteins, not as high as animal proteins, but more comparable to like nuts. So mainly they're used for a protein supplement.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome, thanks, Samantha. Yeah, like Samantha just said, we grow wild simulated ginseng. We also grow shiitake mushrooms, and we implemented a small alley cropping system, which is still in its infancy. But we're utilizing a bunch of the different agroforestry techniques that were talked about today. But for today, we're going to focus on wild simulated ginseng. So, and because we've only got 20 minutes, I think I'm going to kind of take the lead on the presentation, and Justin's going to jump in as needed. So just a little background. I did my undergraduate at Cornell University, and in the natural resources program, I learned about agroforestry and got really interested in the possibilities of it. And I was lucky enough to be able to apprentice with Bob Bifus after I graduated. And he's a retired extension agent who specializes in American ginseng, both wild harvest and on the wild simulated growing system. And I got roped in very quickly to managing American Ginseng Farm, which throughout the Hudson Valley and Catskills, we've planted at this point over 250 acres of wild simulated ginseng. So really taking what is primarily a backyard scale production and going real big, real quick. That's how I met Justin, and we got to know each other. And now we have our own business, Wild Hudson Valley, where we primarily teach about forest farming and about the environmental and human history of the Hudson Valley. So we're kind of presenting in that capacity today, though our involvement with ginseng is primarily with American Ginseng Farm. So just to start off, what is ginseng? It's a small herbaceous plant that grows in the forest understory. It's native to North America, and it prefers cool, shady, moist, generally sloped areas, but that's not a rule. It grows all throughout New York State, and I'll get into more of the background. So the scientific name for ginseng is Panax pincifolius. If you recognize Panax, comes from panacea, in Greek, meaning all healing. And ginseng is primarily grown as a medicinal herb. It's not a food crop. And it's closely related to Asian ginseng, which has been grown which has been used in Chinese medicine for over 2,000 years. And when it was discovered by Europeans that a sister species to Asian ginseng grew in North America in the early 1700s, trade with East Asia quickly developed. But ginseng had been used and is still used by native peoples in northeastern native peoples. And I'll let Justin chime in quickly just to talk about that a little bit.
Oh, we could do a whole presentation on that topic. We actually wrote a paper for Smithsonian a while back on it that's a long story, but yeah, that's just a cool little fact before we continue on. But a lot of people don't realize that when the American ginseng trade started, it was primarily the roots were primarily dug and traded by native people in the Northeast and then in the South later in the 18th century. And it was a huge economic, it was hugely of economic importance for native people here throughout the first half of the 18th century and second half, during a time when they were, there were a lot of wars going on, the French and Indian War and then the Revolution. So it's kind of a cool side thing that a lot of people don't know about, was a native role in that trade. Anyway.
Yeah, so ginseng has had a long history of being harvested in the wild over the last 300 years. And at this point, because of that over harvesting for centuries, it's pretty limited, but it does grow all throughout the Appalachian Mountain Range and generally in this area. So ginseng has a very complicated life cycle that's really important to understand when you're thinking about growing it. So starting with the upper left, we have ginseng seeds, which are about the size of a lentil. And when a berry ripens that contains 1 to 3 seeds on a plant, that seed actually remains dormant in the soil for 18 months on average. And throughout that time, the embryo inside the hard seed is living and breathing. So it's not a plant like, where you take squash seeds and dry them and keep it in a packet in your house. They don't store that way. In fact, if the seed dries out for more than a few weeks, the embryo will shrivel up and die. So it's a finicky plant right from the start. But the first year, that center top picture, that's a ginseng seedling. And that's the way it's going to look for its whole first year of growth. Just 3 little leaflets, kind of looks like a little strawberry leaf. It's very serrated. You can see it's got these little hairs on the veins, which is a great way to identify ginseng compared to some of its lookalikes. Then after the first few years, it may start to get 2 leaves, like the picture on the top right. Those are 2 individual leaves. One of them has 3 leaflets and one has 5 leaflets. But you're looking at 5 years until it looks like that bottom right picture.
That's in good condition. Which
I believe are Tracey Testo's hands, because Tracey actually helped us on the ginseng farm for a few years, a number of years ago. And so when you get these 3-leaved plants, generally it's 5 years or older in the wild. And in the wild, ginseng might not actually replace itself in the wild until it's 10 years old. So that's one of the main reasons why it's so easy to over harvest ginseng, is because it's not going to produce a viable offspring for potentially 10 or more years. But once it gets much older, it might have 4 leaves, sometimes 5 or 6, but that's very rare. And it produces berries in the fall, which normally contain about 2 seeds, and it starts all over again. So you can actually age a ginseng plant by counting the scars on the rhizome of the plant. So every year, the base of the stem will leave a flat scar, and then the next year's stem will grow out and they stack on top of each other. And you can see this plant here was 25 years old when it was harvested, and that root is like barely the size of a ruler. So you can see how small these plants really are and why they fetch such a high value per pound. You're looking at a fairly small harvest for a very valuable root. So internationally, ginseng is listed under Appendix 2 of the CITES Treaty, and it's a species of special concern. So it's not actually listed as threatened or endangered, but it's on a watch list. And because of that, ginseng is regulated by all 17 states in the United States in which it grows. In New York State, for example, there's a ginseng hunting season, just like deer hunting season. You can't harvest ginseng until September 1st to the end of November. And the plants have to be 5 years old. And they're, it's highly regulated in terms of how you can buy and sell the plant, and bringing it across state and federal borders. You need like a certificate. So it's something to consider if you're thinking about growing ginseng, because unfortunately, it's hard to tell the difference between a wild ginseng root and a cultivated ginseng root. So they're actually
Well, that depends on the method of cultivation.
Well, yes, but it's regulated the same no matter what, unless you can sort of prove that you're growing ginseng. And there are third-party verification systems which have been set up just in the last few years. United Plant Savers does a forest grown certification that's specifically for ginseng, where they'll come and verify that you're growing ginseng. So if you're thinking about planting a sizable, a few acres of ginseng or more, you may want to consider getting a third-party verification so that you can prove you're growing it, so that it's not going to be regulated as if it was wild in that same way. So today, 90% of American ginseng on the market is actually grown underneath the shade cloth. As you can imagine, the plant is scattered here and there throughout the forest, and very early on, people were experimenting with how to grow it in a more conventional farming system. And this is what has been developed since the late 1800s. It used to be wooden lattice structures that ginseng was being grown under. Now it's 70% shade cloth. And in this system, you can see you can grow a lot of ginseng in a very small space. But the problem is that ginseng is not happy growing there. It's so different from the way that it grows in the wild that it becomes very susceptible to primarily fungal pathogens. So you're looking at like alternaria and phytophthora, root rot. And so in these systems, you have to spray generally on a 2-week basis, both pesticides and fungicides. And even then, the ginseng plants themselves rarely survive more than 3 or 4 years. Once you pass that 4th year, the plant, you start to lose so many plants to disease that it's better to just harvest it. So you can imagine in the wild, you're not harvesting these plants until they're at least 5 years old or older. So it's a very different style of production. And there's unfortunately no way that this production can be organic. So wild simulated or any woods grown production provides like a slightly less risky way where you'll fetch a higher value. So looking at this picture on the left, those are field grown roots that are about 3 to 4 years old. That's maybe $60 worth of roots. On the right, you're looking at wild simulated roots, which if you look at those longer necks, they're 10 years older or more. And it's, over 10 times the value per root. When you're looking at woods cultivated and wild simulated, those are the two woodland production systems. And only a small amount of the ginseng on the market today comes from these systems. Woods cultivated is using the forest canopy to create shade. But other than that, it's very similar to the shade cloth system. You are tilling and amending the soil, and you have very dense planting rates, and you generally have to spray and in the same way that you do with a more cultivated system, but you have the potential for big harvests. What I focus on is wild simulated ginseng. So that's finding these ideal conditions in which ginseng would naturally thrive. And in many cases, you're growing ginseng right alongside wild ginseng. And in this way, you're using conservation through cultivation. So because wild simulated plants are basically indistinguishable from wild ginseng, they can replace wild ginseng in the marketplace and protect some of these more disjointed wild populations from harvest. But it's a long-term investment. But in our feeling, it's worth it. So I'm going to go a little bit into how to select areas for ginseng, how to plant them, how to steward them, and how to eventually harvest them. But I've only got 10 minutes, so it's going to be quick. So you're looking at old mature woods, generally dominated by sugar maples, but basswood trees, butternut, white ash, sometimes yellow birch, even hemlocks, tulip trees in some parts of the state are all great overstory species. Ginseng has a reputation of growing on the north and east facing slopes. That's not a rule. It's just that north and east facing slopes tend to have the cool, moist habitat in which ginseng really thrives. Whereas when you get to the south and west facing sides of slopes, the hot afternoon sun tends to lead to a more dry environment, and you get more oak hickory dominated overstories. So it's not a rule, but generally north and east facing slopes are where you tend to find ginseng habitat. Areas where it's a lot of conifers, pines, aspen, birch, and invasive species are not great areas to grow ginseng. And with wild stimulated ginseng, you really want to be looking for that ideal habitat and doing as little amendment as you can, because it's a low input system where you're not going to be tilling or amending the soil or changing that environment very much. We do recommend doing soil testing. You're going to look at the calcium, magnesium, and the organic matter. You see on the picture on the top right, this like black, beautiful, rich soil is really what you're looking for ginseng to thrive in. But the last consideration when you're deciding where to plant your ginseng is proximity to your house or an area that you can monitor easily, because security is a concern. Ginseng hunting has been something that people have been doing for hundreds of years and still do. And unfortunately, even though it's not legal to hunt on private land without permission from the landowner, people do it. And, it only takes 1 year out of the 10 years or plus years you're growing ginseng for someone to come through and wipe it out. So thinking about security is an important part.
I just add one thing.
Mm-hmm.
So just to take a step back on the soil, there are thousands, if not millions of acres of sugar maple dominated forests in New York and the Northeast that are not great for growing ginseng, even though it loves sugar maple trees. And that's because that forest is, second, third, fourth growth that was pasture. There's a big difference between that hard soil, low in organic matter, and basically the old growth type soil that ginseng really thrives in. And you're probably going to have to amend that kind of, lower organic matter, newer soil that under younger sugar maple forest, if that's what you have.
Mm-hmm. So the one great way to fine tune an area to plant within your property is to look for what are called indicator plants. So plants that have a similar habitat requirements to ginseng. In this picture, we have maidenhair fern, rattlesnake fern, and blue cohosh, amongst other species. And finding a combination of these plants will really tell you that you're planting in the right place. I'm not going to go into this too much, but Justin actually did write a book on a field guide to finding ginseng habitat, which we have available on our website. What we recommend people do the first year when they're thinking of starting to grow ginseng is to plant test plots. So that might be a 3x3 area or 5x5 area, maybe something a little bigger. And you choose a number of these areas throughout your property and what you think are the best areas. And you just plant a handful of ginseng seeds in each place and see how it does. So you're going to be doing your planting in the fall, and then ginseng germinates in the spring. And if you follow your ginseng throughout that first growing season or even a second growing season, you'll get an idea for where the ginseng is going to do better and where it's going to do poorly, and where you can expand upon your plantings. Because it's such a long-term investment, planting in the wrong place can really mess things up after a few years.
And just don't get too excited if you have really good germination that first year, because ginseng will germinate anywhere. It'll germinate in your refrigerator, on a wet toilet paper roll, or in a sandbox, and survive for weeks, if sometimes months. You really got to give it a few years. This plant takes a lot of patience.
Yes. So when you purchase seed, generally seed always comes from these shade cloth grown operations, which isn't inherently a problem, because it's wild ginseng seed or wild simulated ginseng seed, as far as we know, is not available anywhere on the market. Wild ginseng seed, it's actually not legal to sell seed from because it's listed as a species of concern, and As a steward, you should plant the ginseng seeds back near the rest of the population and not extract that from the woods. You want to keep the population going. So like I said earlier, you need to keep the seeds hydrated. And we aim to plant about 5 seeds per square foot. So that's 4 to 6 inch spacing. If you look at the picture on the top right, you'll see these little red dots scattered around. We actually dye our ginseng seed a red colors when we're planting acres at a time, so that we can toss this seed out and see where it's landing a lot easier than when it's tan colored. So, but that gives you an idea of the kind of spacing that you're looking at. You don't want to plant ginseng too thick because of the potential for fungal pathogens to come in. The more spread out plants are, the less disease will spread through a population. But generally, it's pretty straightforward. You rake back the leaf litter, broadcast the seeds on the soil surface. Sometimes you can stamp on, like I would recommend like kind of stomping on them to make sure that they have a contact with the soil. Some people will actually bury the seeds a little bit. I would never bury them more than an inch deep, because that little seedling has to wind its way up through leaf litter, and it needs all the help it can get. As long as your seeds are in contact with the soil, you're good to go. And then make sure to cover the seeds back up with the leaves. In most cases, you can put the same leaves that you just took off right back on, and make sure that it's a good 2 to 4 inch layer, because you don't want your ginseng seeds to dry out because they're exposed to the elements. And also because ginseng seed that's covered by leaves will be a lot more protected from chipmunks or other squirrels that are out like eating seeds and
Mice.
Foraging in the fall, and mice.
And turkeys.
And turkeys. Yep. And make sure to mark where you plant. So many times I talk to people and they're like, oh yeah, I planted some ginseng a few years ago, but I was never able to find it. So use surveyor flags like in that bottom picture, or somehow mark the trees around the perimeter of where you're planting, so that you can find it, because those little tiny seedlings that stick up maybe an inch from the soil, they're really hard to find amongst all those other companion plants that we talked about. So one thing to keep in mind with ginseng is you don't want to weed it like you would in a garden bed. The more it's growing amongst the other species that it's used to growing in the wild, the better. You don't want to create a situation where it's just this monoculture of ginseng plants, because then you'll have more disease problems down the road. So your ginseng seeds will come up May to early June. You don't want to have, you're generally not going to have a very great germination rate, because you're not even tilling or amending the soil in this case. And you're scattering the seeds, potentially some are landing on rocks, and you only really care to have about 1 plant per square foot, or even every 2-3 feet by the time the plants get to be of an adult age, because again, those fungal pathogens that'll come in. If you end up with an area that's too thick, like that bottom right picture, those are just like, there's probably 100 seedlings in that like 3 square foot or 9 square foot area. You can thin them out. We recommend waiting until year 3, because the little tiny roots that the plants formed in that first year they don't have a great transplant success rate. I would wait till year 3. You'll have at least like an 80% transplant success rate at that point. And some people do sell ginseng transplants, and that's something you can purchase if you're interested in having some ginseng on your property. But in terms of if you're going to have a commercial ginseng operation, it's much more worth your time to start from seed in terms of that initial investment and keeping costs low. So maintenance, the great thing about wild simulated ginseng is that after you plant it, you're really just sort of standing back and watching it grow. You of course need to monitor for disease and pests, but if you've followed what we just said about planting properly, you aren't generally going to have a huge problem with those pests. So, and then on the picture on the right, making sure you have signage to keep people out, and game cameras in the woods are always really helpful. One thing Justin just whispered to me is making sure, one thing you can do to keep other animals from getting to your ginseng
Like turkeys and deer.
plants are to put some brush down after you put the leaf litter back down, putting down some brush so that it holds the leaf litter down, and also makes it harder for deer and other animals to eat your ginseng leaves, because unfortunately deer love ginseng. So this is sort of a reality check. Deer like to eat ginseng. So if you're growing a smaller amount of ginseng, you can fence in an area. But if you're going larger scale and planting a few acres, fencing becomes, more expensive, and it may be, and it may be easier just to control the deer population through hunting. Slugs will eat ginseng foliage, and ginseng will also get eaten by other little insects. We see that every year on our plants. The great thing about ginseng being a perennial plant is that if for some reason the top of the plant is cut off in 1 year, the root will often have enough energy reserves to produce a top that the next year, even though it was eaten. So if a ginseng plant disappears 1 year, it may come back a year or two later. We've sometimes seen ginseng plants be dormant for 3-4 years and then come up and they're fine. It's a very interesting plant to watch in the wild. And when your plants do start to produce seeds, if you want to try to replant those seeds, you have to be careful for rodents, chipmunks. The chipmunk there, all those seeds were inside its little cheeks at one given time. So something to consider. When it comes to harvesting, again, you want to wait till they're at least 5 years old, because that's when it's legal. The hunting season starts September 1st, but I recommend waiting until they're 10 years old or even older. 25-year-old ginseng is going to be worth way more than a 5-year-old plant. You can see from these two pictures. And in my mind, it's definitely worth waiting until your roots have a lot more character. One thing to keep in mind is that because most ginseng is ending up being sold on the East Asian market as medicine, traditionally, the way that ginseng is valued is through its physical appearance. And there are over a dozen different ways to grade ginseng into different levels. And from a Western mindset, we might be like, oh, well, the chemical structure is going to be the same in terms of the medicine, whether it's a young plant or an older plant. But the value is way higher if you can wait until they have a lot of older character. Also, improper harvesting can just ruin the value of your plant. So you want to make sure that you're not breaking it, that you're getting all the root hairs when you're harvesting it. And once you're at the point where you're harvesting ginseng, you're probably going to be working with a buyer, and they'll offer you a lot of guidance and specify how they want their roots. Do they want them fresh? Do they want them dried? And if they want them dried, how do they want them to be dried? So this is my last slide about drying roots. You want to lightly wash the dirt off them, but you don't want to be scrubbing them clean. Having dirt in the wrinkles on the root is great. And so really you just want to be hitting them with a steady stream of water or swishing them around in a basin of water to get the excess dirt off. They don't need to be scrubbed clean. It's better that they're not. Doing that is a way to completely destroy the value of your root. And then you want to dry them slowly. Never dry them in an oven. Dry them at a little warmer than room temperature. A warm attic works great. Spread them out on a single layer, and properly dried roots will store indefinitely. So that gives you some wiggle room in terms of when you go to sell them as an end product. So that was a really fast intro. If anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to us. That's our email right there. And
one thing.
Yes, Justin.
I'm sorry, I know this is probably running late, but one thing, I don't know if we mentioned it, but we've learned this, as have other growers, I'm sure, over the years, through experience, that you really want to mimic natural canopy disturbances. And I think this is probably true of any northeastern forest farmed crops, especially natives. If you want a good yield and healthy plants that don't grow at a snail's pace, you do want to mimic natural canopy disturbance. That means doing some minor thinning of your forest. That might just be branches, it might be sick trees, it might be, certain species, so that you could increase the balance and enrich species diversity. But by doing that and bringing in that little bit of extra light, you are going to see a huge difference. Like, I can't tell you how often we've seen wild simulated ginseng plantings that where the forest was not thinned, and because of the shade, 7-8-year-old plants looked like they were 2 years old. So that's it on my last little thing.
All right.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. What an interesting and fascinating plant that you all have been really building such a detailed relationship with. I can really tell how much care and expertise you bring to ginseng cultivation. Someone in the chat, Brett Chedzoy in particular, also wanted to offer, I think, an extension of your use of brush, this something called slash walls, which I imagine are brush piles, but built big. And so perhaps you've used those, but that's another way to use the natural resources you have around you to help protect these high value crops, and apparently very delicious crops to many creatures. Anyone else have any? Oh, okay. So someone, Michael Rosado, is asking if you have any, if you can list any particularly preferred ginseng seed suppliers, or where we can find that.
Yeah, and that's something I didn't get into because this is such a short presentation. But there are many ways to kill ginseng seed. And so making sure that you're working with a supplier and not just getting plants on like eBay or Etsy is we highly recommend. We work with particular growers in Ontario, and if you want to contact us, we can help you get in touch with them. But we buy pre-stratified seeds. I see Jeff is chiming in asking about that. So the growers will harvest the seeds in one fall and then store them throughout that first winter and into the following spring. They actually completely dry them out at that point because they're still relatively dormant. And they keep them in cold stratification. And then what needs to happen is that embryo needs to spend about 3 months of a warm period expanding, and so it fills out the shell, and then sometimes it actually cracks open the shell a little bit, and that's called smiling seed, and that's really great. And that happens by the following fall, which is when we would be planting it for germination the next spring. So we're buying seed that's already pre-stratified. It's had that first dormant season, and we work with these growers in Ontario. We actually sell seed, so that's where we get our seed.
Yeah, we we do the final worm stratification ourselves because it really makes a difference on the next year's germination.
Yeah, what we do is we store the seed in sand on our farm where it's in dappled sunlight, so it's getting its naturally warm period for about a few months before we plant it. And we keep it in an area where it's not going to get fungal pathogens as easily in the sand. So that makes sense.
Yeah, we sterilize it. What else? Was there anything else on the seeds? I'm trying to. There was something else. Oh, yeah. A lot of people are always looking for wild simulated seed. I could tell you again from since we've planted like multiple 100 acres. I don't think it's possible to viably grow wild simulated ginseng for seed production. It would be extremely labor intensive. It is very possible, but the seed would be as practically as expensive as the roots probably, just because it would be so labor intensive to harvest them. So all the seed on the market pretty much is coming from shade cloth, field growers. I don't really think there's a way around it. The cool thing is, ginseng seed has been collected from around the Eastern North American continent and collected for a century and a half at the very least. And studies have shown that the genetics of the seed, its parentage is coming from everywhere. I mean, you'll find genetics and seed from Ontario, there'll be genetics from Wisconsin and North Carolina and the Northeast. So you're getting like super seed in a sense.
Hybrid vigor.
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, if other of the presenters want to put your contact information in the chat in case other people would like to reach out to you. I'd just like to give all of our presenters a huge warm round of applause. Thank you so much. All of you are incredible experts. It's really clear how much time and expertise that you have built around this. It's really incredible the wealth of knowledge and experience that we have, and we have covered such an amazing diversity of cropping systems and plant types and agroforestry systems. Really, and we've only really just scratched the surface on the potential of agroforestry in the Northeast. So it's really exciting. I hope to see interest and events like this grow in the further.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.